Hi, and welcome to IELTSessay.com. My name's Ian, and I'm going to guide you through this sample task 1 essay, and it's going to be a line graph. So, if we have a look at this line graph, you can see it says the title is U.S. Energy Consumption by Fuel from 1980 to 2030. And it has multiple lines, and they're all in a different color and different shape, but what you need to pay attention to first is the axis. So on this vertical axis you can see the figures are given in numbers, and more specifically quadrillion units. It goes from 0 quadrillion units to 50 quadrillion units. On the horizontal axis you see it says history and projections. Projections means sort of like predictions into the future. So this starts in the past. 1980 is the first year that they show us, and it goes all the way until the present, which at the moment is 2014, and then it has projections for the future. Okay, so this is the line graph, and you have one line that says petrol and oil, and then you have another one, the black one here, that says coal, and you have the dotted one that says natural gas, and at the bottom you have another 3 lines, nuclear energy or nuclear consumption, and then you have solar, wind consumption, and then you have hydropower consumption, which is the last line. Fine, so this is the multiple line graph here. Now every task 1 essay always comes with a question prompt. Okay, so the question prompt here says the graph gives information about consumption of energy in the United States of America since 1980 with projections until 2030. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. It always says this, so ignore this part. The more important part is here, the question prompt. Okay, so how do we approach this kind of essay task? Well, every task 1 essay follows the same structure. There are individual differences, but basically they all have the same structure. So if we go on task 1 components, you will see every task 1 essay basically has 3 components. And I'll show you how these 3 components relate to the scoring criteria in a moment. Let's have a look at this. So number 1 says introduce the graph. So you're going to have to write 1 or 2 sentences that state what the IELTS writing task 1 shows. In this case, what this graph shows. To do this, paraphrase the title of the graph. Paraphrasing means to use your own words, but basically say the same thing as in the question. Okay, so if we go back to the graph, and this is the title of the graph and the question prompt to it, so this is the part that we have to paraphrase. We have to rewrite this in our own words, and I'll show you how to do this in a moment. Okay, so going back to the task 1 components, the second part now is to give an overview. Many IELTS test takers ignore this. You need to have an overview. So what is an overview? It says here you also need to state what the main trend or trends in the graph are. Don't give details such as data here. You're just looking for something that describes what is happening overall. So the overview is sort of like what I like to call the big picture. What is going on here? Is there like a major trend? So if we go back to the graph, you will see straight away, if we look at this, we can see that the consumption of petrol and oil is the highest throughout this whole number of years, and it's also increasing, it's rising. Now that's one of the major things that you can see straight away. You can also see that coal and natural gas are sort of in the middle, and the least consumed energy fuels are nuclear, solar, and wind and hydropower. You can also notice that these are not really rising. In case of hydropower, which is just another word for water, water energy that is generated from water, is actually has leveled off here. It's not rising, it's not falling, it just has leveled off here. At least that's what the projections show. So the main trend here, the overview, is that the consumption of petrol and oil is the highest, while nuclear, solar, wind, and hydropower, which are in part forms of alternative energy, are the lowest. So that's what's going on here. That would be the overview. Okay, going back to task components. Now that we know what the overview is, which is sort of like the big picture and the main trend, now what we have to do after that is we have to give the details. Okay, so you can now give more specific detail in the body paragraphs. When you give the detail in your body paragraphs in your IELTS Writing Task 1, you must make reference to the data, which means you have to have figures or numbers in your body paragraphs. If you don't have any numbers or data in your paragraphs, then you will not be able to achieve a very high score, and I'll show you that in a moment. The key to organizing your body paragraphs for an IELTS Writing Task 1 is to group the data together where there are patterns. To do this, you need to identify any similarities and differences. So, what does that mean, to group data together where there are patterns? Now, if we look at this graph again, you can clearly see there basically are three groups. So there is a pattern. There is one group, although there's only one line in there, which is petrol and oil. Then there's a second group here, coal and natural gas. And then there's a third group here, which includes nuclear energy, solar and wind, and hydropower energy. So you can see that, you know, there are three distinctive groups. So when you write your body paragraphs, you want to sort of order your paragraphs according to these groups. I'll show you in a moment how that works. Okay, so again, basically there are three main components to each Task 1 essay. Introducing the graph, you paraphrase the question. Giving an overview, so what is going on, what is the main trend, and the third is giving the details, and you need to describe the data. You have to give specific numbers. Right, so how are these three components related to the scoring criteria? If we look at the scoring criteria, this is a very big table, and I'm not going to go over each and every box here, but this is called the IELTS Writing Band Descriptors. Now, when the IELTS examiner is reading your essay, he will look at four different criteria, sort of four areas. One is going to be called task achievement, which basically means how well did you answer the question. The second one is coherence and cohesion, and this is all about how you ordered and arranged the information in your body paragraphs, and also if you are using transitions. Okay. The third category here is lexical resource, which basically is just a technical word for vocabulary. Are you able to use a wide range of vocabulary, or do you only use simple words? The last category here is the grammatical range and accuracy, which basically is grammar. How many grammar mistakes did you make in your essay, and did you use a variety of sentence structures, and so on. I'll go over this in a moment. Okay, so let's have a look. So perhaps you are focusing on getting an overall writing score of 6. Okay, so if we look at task achievement, which again, remember, this is how well did you answer the question. Now, let's look at band score 5. It says here, generally addresses the task. The format may be inappropriate in places recounts detail mechanically with no clear overview. So this is where the whole part of the overview fits in. If you don't have an overview, you most likely are going to end up in band score 5 for this criteria. So there are 4 categories, and at the end, the average of every category will make up your IELTS score. So let's say we didn't have a clear overview, we probably get a 5 here. Okay, let's have a look at box 6 for band score 6. Addresses the requirements of the task, means you have a complete answer. Presents an overview, here you go. So if you have an overview, you most likely will fall in this category. Presents and adequately highlights key features, bullet points, but details may be irrelevant, inappropriate, or inaccurate. So you're allowed to do some mistakes here in terms of selecting the information. But the most important part is you need an overview if you want to reach a band score of 6 for this criteria. Let's have a look at coherence and cohesion. Again, we're going to look at band score 5 first. Here it says presents information with some organization, but there may be a lack of overall progression, which basically means that yes, there is some organization, but it's a little bit unclear. Makes inadequate, inaccurate, or overuse of cohesive devices. Cohesive devices are transitions such as moreover, therefore, first, second, third, and so on. All these kind of words are there to make your essay more coherent, which means it's easier to follow, easier to read. If you only have a string of sentences without any transition words, then it's difficult to read, and you're not going to score very highly. On the other hand, if you use too many, which it says here also, overuse, then you might also end up in this box, band score of 5. So what to do if you want to have a band score of 6 for this criteria? It says here, arranges information and ideas coherently, and there's a clear overall progression. Uses cohesive devices effectively, but cohesion within and or between sentences may be faulty or mechanical. May not always use referencing clearly or appropriately. Basically, to sum this box up here is that you need to have some sort of good structure in your essay, and you need to use some cohesive devices effectively. Then you will end up in band score box 6. If we have a look at Lexical Resource, remember this is just another word for vocabulary. If we look at band score 5, uses a limited range of vocabulary, but this is minimally adequate for the task. So perhaps your vocabulary range is not very wide. You only use simple words and you don't really know what kind of vocabulary to use for this kind of graph. Then you probably will end up in this category here, and you'll get a band score of 5. To get a 6, it says here, uses an adequate range of vocabulary for the task. Attempts to use less common vocabulary but with some inaccuracy. So you need to be a little bit of a risk taker. You need to try to use some less common vocabulary, even if it's not always completely accurate. You make some mistakes, that's fine, but you should try to use some less common words. Make some errors in spelling and or word formation, but they do not impede communication. So it is okay to do some mistakes here, spelling mistakes, and you could still get a 6. If we have a look at grammar, again, we'll start with band score of 5, which is probably the score you don't want. It says only uses a limited range of structures. So perhaps your sentences are all simple sentences, or they are too short. Attempts complex sentences, but these tend to be less accurate than simple sentences. So maybe you did try to use a few longer sentences, but they are marred with mistakes. May make frequent grammatical errors, and punctuation may be faulty. Errors can cause some difficulty for the reader. So if the examiner reads this and it causes difficulty for him or her to understand, you're probably going to look at this range of band score 5. So what to do if you want to have a 6? Uses a mix of simple and complex sentence forms, makes some errors in grammar and punctuation, but they rarely reduce communication. So again, you can make some mistakes, some grammar mistakes, but as long as they're not reducing the communication. If it reduces the communication, means it's causing difficulty for the reader, and then it would be a 5. So if you want to score overall 6 here, you would have to have at least a 6 in each of these 4 criteria. So this is how it is scored, just very briefly. As I said, I don't want to go into much detail here. Now, let's have a look at the sample essay. The first thing, remember, is to introduce the graph. So I have here 2 sentences, and it says, the graph illustrates U.S. energy consumption since 1980 with a projection for 2030. Right, so this is a paraphrase. If you look at the original says the graph gives information about consumption. What I wrote here is the graph illustrates U.S. energy consumptions. So I changed a few words around, which is paraphrasing. Then I go on and I say the figures for the different types of energy are given in quadrillion units used, and the timeline is given in years. So I'm actually pointing out here how this information is organized, how the figures are given. They're given in units and they're given in years. I'm also saying here the data can be grouped in highly used, moderately used, and least used energy sources. Remember, those were the 3 groups. This is highly used, moderately used, and low usage of energy. Now, what I've done here is I've categorized the data, and I'm also shown how, in what sort of figures the information is presented. If we go back to scoring criteria, you will see that this should fall under 7. If you look at task achievement, which is the first category, and if you look at band score 7, it says covers the requirements of the task. Okay, but the next point is important. Presents a clear overview of main trends, differences, or stages. Clearly presents and highlights key features and bullet points. So that's what I did. I not only did I paraphrase it, but I've gone a step further, and I have shown in what sort of how the figures are given. They're given in units and they're given in years. Now, this is the first part. The second part, if you remember, is the overview. And the overview will most likely start with some sort of transition word. I used overall here. You could use all in all, or in brief, or as an overview, but I chose to use overall. Okay, so it says overall, it can be seen that fossil fuels, and especially oil and petrol, are dominating the energy consumption in the US, while nuclear and renewable energy are the least used energy sources. So this is my overview. I pointed out that petrol and oil are used most, and nuclear and renewable energy are the least used energy sources. Remember, if we go back to the graph, that's the main thing that's going on here. Petrol and oil is used the most, and least are nuclear, solar, wind, and hydropower. That's sort of the big picture. That is the overview. Okay, so I spent 1 sentence on that. Now I'm going to start with the details. So I use a transition here to begin with highly used energy sources. It can be seen that the consumption of petrol and oil in the early 80s was at around 35 quadrillion units. So remember here, I'm giving numbers. I'm showing a specific set of data here. The consumption level fluctuated in the first years, after which it gradually increased, with projections for 2030 being at nearly 50 quadrillion units. So I'm using vocabulary here that is specifically for line graphs. And I'm saying here that the consumption level fluctuated. So what does fluctuate mean? If you look at the graph, fluctuating is something that is going up and down, sort of like a wavy pattern, and that's what it does here. It's fluctuating in the beginning. Okay, moving on. The consumption level, oh sorry, I had this already. Coal and natural gas belonging to the moderately consumed energy sources were at 16 and 20 quadrillion units in 1985 respectively. So again, I'm starting here at 1985 and I'm giving specific figures. Both consumption levels have fluctuated but gradually increased over the next 30 years. Gradually increased means that they increase slightly. So not a very steep increase or not a very rapid increase, they gradually increased. Again, these are words that you want to use in a line graph. While coal consumption is predicted to further climb, natural gas will level off from 2015 onwards. To level off means that it is not going to change. It's going to remain stable. So this is what I showed you earlier, that here the figures are leveling off. There's no change. It's just a straight line that's leveling off. Okay. Now, nuclear and renewable energy has been consumed least over the time frame, with consumption levels starting at approximately 3 quadrillion units in 1985. Nuclear and solar wind energy consumption levels have increased only slightly over the years. So they have increased, but only very little bit, so that would be slightly. With projections for 2030, consumption at 7 and 6 quadrillion units respectively. Hydropower is the only energy source to decrease over the time frame. So it decreased, it actually went down. Now you notice that this task 1 essay does not have a conclusion, and in fact for a task 1 essay you do not need a conclusion. You could write one, but you don't really need one, and that's why I didn't write one here. So again, I have 3 main components in this essay. I introduce the graph and I paraphrase the question prompt or the title. Then I'm actually doing something what a level 7 writer would do. I'm showing how the figures are presented in units and in years. And I'm actually also grouping the energy sources, which also is what a band 7 or higher writer would do. That's the first component. The second component is my overview, which is only 1 sentence, where I show the main trend of what is going on, sort of the big picture. And then I begin with the details, and I use transitions here. You want to use transitions, remember, if you want to score high in the second category of coherence and cohesion. So I use transitions here. I go into the details, I present numbers, very important. If you don't present any numbers, you're probably going to be stuck at a band score of 5. So I present numbers here, and the whole body paragraph here is ordered according to the grouping that I recognized earlier. Remember, if we go back to the graph, there are 3 groups here, and I am describing the data, or I should say the information, from the first group on to the second group to the third group, giving specific numbers here. And then I end without a conclusion. If you wanted to write a conclusion, your conclusion would be similar to your overview, but you don't need one, and that's why I didn't write one. So here you go. This is a task 1 sample essay for a multiple line graph. For more information and more sample essays, you can visit our website at www.IELTSessay.com. Hi, and welcome.